The iron gates of Valorhold Castle swung open, and Aria Longmane walked through them with her head held high, her green skin gleaming in the afternoon sun, her small tusks catching the light as she refused to lower her gaze before the assembled nobles who sneered down at her from their balconies. She had been summoned here as part of a peace treaty between the human kingdom of Valorhold and the Stonefist clan, a marriage arrangement that would bind two warring peoples together. And though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run back to the mountains she called home, she forced herself to keep walking forward into the grand courtyard, where hundreds of courtiers had gathered to witness the arrival of the orc bride. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat fields. Aria could hear every cruel word, every horrified gasp, every muttered prayer for protection from the monster in their midst. She wore the finest clothes her clan could provide, leather armor decorated with intricate beadwork, and a cloak of wolf fur that had belonged to her grandmother. But she knew the humans saw nothing but her green skin and her tusks, and the pointed ears that marked her as something other than themselves. Her betrothed, Lord Cyrus Ashford, stood at the top of the marble steps leading into the castle, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust as he watched her approach. The herald called out in a booming voice that echoed off the stone walls. "Kneel before Lord Cyrus Ashford, your lord and husband-to-be, and before the assembled court of Valorhold." Aria stopped walking. The entire courtyard fell silent, waiting to see if the savage orc woman would obey. She looked up at Cyrus Ashford with his golden hair and his perfect features and his fine silk clothes, and she saw nothing in his eyes but contempt. She thought of her father's words before she left the mountain stronghold, how he had gripped her shoulders and told her that she carried the honor of their entire clan on her back, that she must endure whatever humiliation came her way for the sake of peace. She thought of the children who would not have to grow up fleeing human soldiers, of the families who would not be burned out of their homes, of all the blood that would not be spilled if she could just bend her knees and bow her head. But when she opened her mouth, the word that came out was clear and firm. "No!" The courtyard erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage. Guards reached for their weapons. Cyrus Ashford's face turned purple with fury as he descended the steps, his hand on the pommel of his sword. "You dare refuse me? You savage creature, I could have you executed for such insolence." Aria met his gaze without flinching. "Then execute me, but I will not kneel to a man who looks at me like I am something he scraped off his boot." For a long moment, she thought he might actually draw his sword. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to choke on. Then a quiet voice spoke from somewhere behind the crowd, barely audible over the murmuring nobles. "Perhaps we might discuss this matter inside, away from prying eyes." Aria turned her head, searching for the source of the voice. The crowd parted reluctantly, and a man stepped forward. He was not dressed in fine silks like the other nobles, but in simple wool and leather that looked more suited to a farmer than a courtier. His brown hair was tied back from his face, and his green eyes held no disgust or contempt, only a kind of weary understanding. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 20 summers, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen much of the world and found little of it pleasant. "And who are you?" Cyrus Ashford demanded, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Everett Dalton, my lord. I serve as the castle's master of horses, among other duties." The man bowed slightly to Cyrus, but his eyes flicked back to Aria. "With respect, my lord, the treaty specified that the Lady Aria was to be received with honor befitting an ambassador of her people. Demanding she kneel before the assembled court was not part of the agreed-upon terms." Aria felt something shift in her chest. This human stable hand, this man who worked with animals and dirt, was defending her when all the fine lords and ladies wanted her humiliated. She studied his face more carefully, noting the calluses on his hands and the scars on his forearms that spoke of hard labor and harder fights. Cyrus Ashford waved his hand dismissively. "Very well. Guards, escort our guest to her chambers. We will have the formal reception dinner tonight, where I am certain she will remember her manners." He turned on his heel and strode back up the steps, his elaborate cloak swirling behind him. The guards moved forward, their hands on their weapons, and Aria found herself surrounded by armed men who looked at her with fear and hatred. But before they could close in completely, Everett Dalton stepped smoothly between her and the nearest guard. "I will show the lady to her chambers myself," he said quietly. "Unless you would prefer to explain to King Aldrich why the peace treaty collapsed on its first day because his guards manhandled an ambassador." The guards hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. Finally, the captain nodded curtly. "Be quick about it." Everett turned to Aria and gestured toward a side entrance to the castle, away from the main steps where Cyrus had disappeared. "This way, if you please." Aria followed him, intensely aware of all the eyes watching her, all the hostile faces tracking her every movement. She kept her spine straight and her chin up, refusing to show any weakness, but inside she felt the weight of what she had just done pressing down on her. She had insulted her future husband in front of his entire court. She had jeopardized the peace treaty before it could even be signed. Her father would be devastated. Her clan would suffer for her pride. They walked through narrow corridors that twisted and turned through the castle's servants' passages, far from the grand halls and tapestried rooms where the nobles lived. Everett moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every stone of this place, and Aria found herself studying him as they walked. He was tall for a human, though still shorter than her by several inches, and his shoulders were broad from years of physical labor. There was something quiet and steady about him, like a deep river that flowed smoothly beneath a calm surface. Finally, they emerged into a small courtyard garden, and Everett stopped walking. He turned to face her, and for the first time she could see the full measure of exhaustion in his eyes. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said without preamble. "Probably both." Aria bristled. "I will not be humiliated for their entertainment. I understand." And the strange thing was, his tone suggested that he actually did. "But you have put yourself in a dangerous position. Cyrus Ashford is not a forgiving man, and he has the king's ear." "Then why did you help me?" Aria demanded. "Why defend a monster? That is what they all think I am, is it not?" Everett was quiet for a moment, his green eyes searching her face. "I spent 3 years fighting on the border," he said finally. "I saw what both sides did to each other, the cruelty and the hatred and the senseless waste of it all. When I heard about the peace treaty, I thought perhaps there was hope that it could end. But when I saw how they planned to receive you, I knew that some people here have no interest in real peace. They want surrender and submission." Aria felt her throat tighten. She had not expected this human to understand anything about her situation, much less to articulate it so clearly. "You were a soldier, a veteran of the border wars, yes. I returned home 2 years ago and took work here because I needed to eat, and the king's stables pay better than most." He glanced back toward the castle proper, where sounds of the dispersing crowd drifted through the corridors. "Come. Your actual chambers are in the West Tower. I will take you there now, before someone decides to cause more trouble." They walked in silence through more twisting passages, climbing stone stairs that spiraled upward into one of the castle's many towers. Aria's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. She had come here prepared to endure humiliation for the sake of peace, but she had not anticipated how it would feel to be looked at with such naked hatred by so many people at once. And she had not anticipated Everett Dalton, this quiet human who spoke to her like she was a person rather than a political bargaining chip. The chambers they finally reached were surprisingly spacious, with large windows overlooking the valley below and furnishings that, while not as elaborate as she imagined the noble quarters would be, were comfortable and well made. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and someone had left a tray of food on the table. "I asked the kitchen staff to prepare something that would not offend your dietary customs," Everett said, nodding toward the tray. "Roasted venison, root vegetables, bread without animal fat in the preparation." "I hope that is acceptable." Aria stared at him. "You asked them to do that." It seemed the courteous thing to do. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "The dinner tonight will be difficult. Cyrus will try to assert his authority over you, and the other nobles will be watching to see if you can be broken. But you should know that not everyone in this castle wishes you ill. Some of us want the peace to succeed." "Why are you telling me this?" Aria asked. "What do you gain from helping me?" Everett looked back at her, and she saw something deep and sad in his eyes. "I have seen too many people die for nothing," he said quietly. "If I can help prevent more deaths by showing a bit of kindness to someone who deserves it, then perhaps I can sleep a little better at night." He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Aria stood alone in the chamber, feeling more confused than she had since arriving at this hostile place. She moved to the window and looked out over the valley, at the fields and forests stretching away toward the mountains where her clan lived. She wondered what her father was doing now, whether he was worried about her, whether he had any idea how badly the reception had gone. She ate the food Everett had arranged for her, surprised to find that it was actually quite good, prepared with care rather than contempt. Then she sat by the fire and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In a few hours, she would have to face the entire court again at dinner, and this time she would be expected to play her role as the dutiful bride. She thought about Cyrus Ashford's cold eyes and cruel mouth, and her stomach churned at the thought of being bound to him for the rest of her life. When the time came for dinner, a servant knocked on her door and escorted her down to the great hall. Aria had changed into a formal dress that combined orcish and human styles, made by her clan's best seamstresses as a gesture of goodwill. The fabric was fine linen dyed deep blue, decorated with silver embroidery in patterns that represented the mountains and rivers of her homeland. She wore her hair loose down her back, as was the custom for unmarried orcish women, and she had polished her tusks until they gleamed. The great hall was enormous, with vaulted ceilings and walls covered in tapestries depicting human victories over various enemies. Aria noted with grim humor that at least two of the tapestries showed humans triumphing over orcs. The long tables were filled with nobles dressed in their finest clothes, and at the head of the hall sat King Aldrich himself, an elderly man with a white beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Cyrus Ashford sat at the king's right hand, and he watched Aria's entrance with a calculating expression. There was an empty seat beside him, clearly meant for her. As Aria walked down the center aisle between the tables, the hall fell silent. She could feel the weight of hundreds of hostile stares pressing against her skin. She reached the high table and stood before it, waiting to see what would happen next. King Aldrich studied her for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that carried through the entire hall. "Lady Aria Longmane of the Stonefist clan, you are welcome in our court. Please be seated." It was not a request to kneel. Aria felt a small measure of relief as she moved to take the empty seat beside Cyrus. But as she sat down, he leaned close to her and whispered in a voice only she could hear. "You embarrass me today, savage. Do not think I will forget it." Aria turned to look at him directly. "Then perhaps you should not have tried to humiliate me in front of your entire court, my lord." His hand clenched into a fist on the table, but he said nothing more. The servants began bringing out course after course of elaborate food, and Aria ate sparingly, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that surrounded her. The nobles made no effort to include her in their conversations, and Cyrus spoke only to the people on his other side, deliberately excluding her. She was scanning the room, feeling increasingly isolated and angry when her eyes landed on a familiar figure. Everett Dalton sat at one of the lower tables, far from the high nobility but not quite among the servants. He was listening to the man beside him speak, but his attention kept drifting toward the high table toward her. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Aria found herself drawing strength from that simple gesture. At least one person in this hostile place saw her as something other than a monster or a political tool. She made it through the dinner by focusing on small things: the taste of the wine, the warmth of the fire, the knowledge that eventually this ordeal would end. When the meal finally concluded, King Aldrich stood and made a speech about peace and cooperation between humans and orcs. It was full of fine words that meant nothing, as far as Aria could tell, because the man giving the speech had allowed his courtiers to treat her with contempt from the moment she arrived. When the king finished, Cyrus stood as well. "Tomorrow, we will have the formal betrothal ceremony," he announced. "Lady Aria will swear her loyalty to me and to the crown of Valorhold, and we will be bound by law and custom." The hall erupted in polite applause. Aria felt her chest tighten. Tomorrow. She had one night left before she would be legally bound to this cruel man for the rest of her life. The dinner broke up slowly, with nobles lingering to gossip and drink. Aria rose from her seat, intending to return to her chambers when Cyrus grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight enough to hurt. "You will kneel tomorrow," he said softly. "I will make certain of it." Aria jerked her wrist free. "We will see." She walked away before he could respond, moving through the crowd of nobles who parted before her like water before the prow of a ship. No one spoke to her. No one smiled. She might as well have been invisible, except for the hostile stares that tracked her every movement. She was halfway to the door when a hand touched her elbow gently. She spun around, ready to defend herself, and found Everett Dalton standing there. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There is something you should see." Aria hesitated, then nodded. She followed him out of the great hall and through more corridors, descending stairs into the lower levels of the castle. They emerged into the stables, a long building filled with horses and the warm smell of hay and animal. Lanterns hung from hooks along the walls, casting everything in soft golden light. Everett led her to a stall at the far end, where a large mare stood with a newborn foal at her side. The foal was all legs and wobbling steps, and it looked up at them with huge dark eyes. "She was born this afternoon," Everett said softly. "I have been checking on them between my other duties." Aria moved closer to the stall, drawn by the sight of the fragile new life. The mare nickered softly, and Everett made a soothing sound that calmed her. He reached over the stall door and ran his hand along the mare's neck. "Why did you bring me here?" Aria asked. Everett was quiet for a moment, his attention on the horses. "Because I thought you might need to see something gentle and hopeful after the cruelty of that dinner." He glanced at her. "And because I wanted to tell you that you do not have to go through with the ceremony tomorrow." Aria's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have access to the stables, and the stables have access to the outside walls. If you wanted to leave, I could help you." He met her eyes steadily. The peace treaty would collapse, but you would be free. Aria felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. My clan needs this peace. My people need it. If I run, the war will begin again and more will die. I know, Everett said gently. But you are a person, not a sacrifice. You deserve to have a choice. I made my choice when I agreed to come here, Aria said, but her voice wavered. She looked at the foal, at its innocent face and wobbly legs. I just did not expect it to be so hard. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy, Everett said. He hesitated, then added, for what it is worth, I think you are remarkably brave. Braver than anyone else in that hall tonight, including the king himself. Aria turned to look at him fully. In the soft light of the stable lanterns, his face seemed younger and more open than it had before. She saw the scars on his hands where he gripped the stall door, the old pain in his eyes that spoke of things he had seen and done during the war. He was just a stable hand, a veteran trying to find peace in his own way, but he had shown her more kindness in one day than anyone else in this entire castle. Why do you care what happens to me? She asked. Everett smiled faintly. Because someone should. And because I think you and I understand each other in ways that most people would not comprehend. They stood together in the warm quiet of the stables, and Aria felt something shift inside her chest. It was not attraction, not yet, but it was the beginning of connection. This man had offered her an escape, even though it would cost him dearly if he were discovered helping her. This man saw her as a person worthy of choice and dignity. I will not run, she said finally, but I am grateful that you would help me if I chose to. Everett nodded slowly. Then I will support you tomorrow, in whatever way I can. They walked back through the castle together, parting ways when they reached the tower where Aria's chambers were located. She climbed the stairs alone, her mind full of thoughts of Everett Dalton and his quiet kindness. When she reached her room, she found that someone had left fresh flowers on her bedside table and had banked the fire so it would burn through the night. She suspected she knew who had arranged these small comforts. That night, she barely slept. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and thought about the ceremony that would take place in the morning, about how Cyrus would try to force her to kneel, about how her refusal might destroy the peace treaty her father had worked so hard to negotiate. She thought about Everett and his offer of escape, about the sadness in his eyes and the gentleness in his hands as he had touched the mare's neck. She thought about choices and consequences, and the weight of responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. When dawn finally came, Aria rose and dressed in the most formal clothes her clan had provided, a dress of deep green leather decorated with silver chains and the symbols of her family. She braided her hair in the warrior's style, pulling it back from her face so nothing could hide her features. If she was going to face this ordeal, she would do it as herself, an orc woman of the Stonefist clan, not as some diminished version of herself designed to please human sensibilities. Servants came to escort her to the great hall, where the ceremony would take place. As she walked through the corridors, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. She did not know what she would do when the moment came. Would she kneel? Would she refuse again and watch everything collapse? The great hall was even more crowded than it had been the night before. It seemed that every noble and courtier in the kingdom had come to witness the betrothal. They lined the walls and filled the galleries above, all of them watching her with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity. At the front of the hall, King Aldrich sat on his throne, and beside him stood Cyrus Ashford, dressed in cloth of gold and looking every inch the triumphant conqueror. Aria walked down the center aisle alone, her head high, her tusks gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the high windows. When she reached the dais where the king and Cyrus waited, she stopped and stood straight, meeting their eyes without fear. The court priest, an elderly man in elaborate robes, stepped forward and began reading from a scroll. The words washed over Aria without really registering, something about duty and loyalty and the binding of two peoples. She was too focused on Cyrus, on the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he waited for his moment of triumph. Finally, the priest finished his recitation and looked at Aria. "Do you, Lady Aria Longmane, swear to honor and obey Lord Cyrus Ashford as your husband and lord? Do you pledge your loyalty to him and to the crown of Valorhold?" The entire hall held its breath. Aria looked at Cyrus, at his smug expression and his cold eyes. She thought about a lifetime spent with this man, about being forced to submit to his will and his cruelty. She thought about her clan and the peace they needed so desperately. Then she thought about Everett Dalton, standing somewhere in this crowd, who had told her that she deserved to have a choice. "I will honor the peace treaty between my people and yours," Aria said clearly. "I will serve as an ambassador and work toward understanding between our peoples, but I will not swear to obey any man who has shown me nothing but contempt." Chaos erupted. Nobles shouted in outrage. King Aldrich rose from his throne, his face dark with anger. Cyrus Ashford stepped toward her, his hand on his sword. "You dare," he snarled. "You savage creature, I will have you thrown in the dungeons for this insult." "Then throw me in the dungeons," Aria said steadily. "But know that if you do, the Stonefist clan will hear of how their ambassador was treated, and the peace will end." "My lord, if I may speak," the voice came from the crowd, and once again it was Everett Dalton who stepped forward. He moved through the press of nobles until he stood before the dais, and then he did something that shocked everyone in the hall. He knelt. He knelt before King Aldrich, his head bowed, his hands open and empty. "Your Majesty, I beg you to hear me." The king looked down at him with narrowed eyes. "Speak, Everett Dalton." The peace treaty specified that Lady Aria would be received with honor and treated as an ambassador of her people. It did not specify that she must submit to humiliation, or that she must marry Lord Cyrus if the match proves unsuitable. Everett kept his head bowed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Perhaps there is another way to satisfy the terms of the treaty, another arrangement that would preserve the peace while respecting Lady Aria's dignity." "And what arrangement would that be?" King Aldrich demanded. Everett raised his head and looked directly at the king. "Let me marry her." The hall exploded in shock and outrage. Nobles screamed protests. Cyrus Ashford looked like he might draw his sword and strike Everett down on the spot. But Aria stood frozen, staring at this quiet man who had just offered to bind his life to hers, who had knelt before his king to protect her when she herself had refused to kneel. King Aldrich held up his hand for silence, and gradually the hall quieted. He studied Everett with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You would marry an orc woman, take her as your wife in truth, not just in name?" "I would, your Majesty." Everett's voice did not waver. "I have more experience with the orc people than most in this court. I fought against them and I respect them. I believe I could make this marriage work in a way that would honor both our peoples." "This is preposterous," Cyrus Ashford spat. "He is a stable hand, a common soldier. He has no rank, no title, no wealth. The treaty called for a marriage to nobility." "The treaty called for a marriage to a citizen of Valorhold who could represent the kingdom," Everett said quietly. "I am a veteran of the border wars and I serve in the king's household. I may not be noble, but I am no peasant either." King Aldrich looked at Aria. "And what say you, Lady Aria? Would you accept this man as your husband?" Aria found her voice at last. She looked at Everett, still kneeling before the king, and she thought about how he had defended her from the first moment they met. How he had shown her kindness when everyone else showed her hatred. How he had offered her escape, and then when she chose to stay, had offered her this instead. "I would," she said softly, "if he would have me." Everett turned his head to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw a genuine smile cross his face. "I would be honored." The king was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. The marriage will take place, but not today. You will have 1 month to determine if this match is truly suitable. During that time, Lady Aria will remain in the castle as our guest, and Everett Dalton will serve as her guide and companion. If at the end of the month you both still wish to proceed with the marriage, I will give my blessing. If not, we will revisit the terms of the peace treaty." It was more than Aria had dared to hope for. She looked at Everett, who rose to his feet and bowed to the king. Then he turned to her and offered his hand. "Shall we leave these good people to their gossip?" he asked quietly. Aria took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. Together they walked out of the great hall, leaving behind the shocked nobles and the furious Cyrus Ashford and the calculating king. They walked through the corridors of the castle until they reached the small courtyard garden where Everett had first brought her the day before. Only when they were alone did Aria finally speak. "Why did you do that? You have put yourself in danger for me." Everett looked at her steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I meant what I said. I think we understand each other." "You knelt for me," Aria said softly. "You knelt before your king to protect me when I refused to kneel before anyone." "That is different," Everett said. "I knelt to ask for justice, not to submit to cruelty. There is no shame in kneeling for the right reasons." Aria felt tears running down her cheeks, and she did not try to stop them. "I do not even know you." "Then we have a month to learn," Everett said gently. He reached up and carefully wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. No pressure, no expectations, just two people trying to build something better than the hatred that came before. Over the following weeks, Aria and Everett spent nearly every day together. He showed her the castle and the lands around it, taught her about human customs and culture, answered her endless questions with patience and humor. She told him about her clan, about growing up in the mountains, about the raids and the wars and the desperate hope that peace might finally be possible. They went riding together through the fields, and Everett taught her the human style of horsemanship, which was different from the orcish way. They worked together in the stables, and Aria helped deliver another foal and felt pride at helping bring new life into the world. They walked through the markets in the town beyond the castle walls, and though people stared and sometimes muttered, Everett's presence kept them safe, and they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, about the war and the peace, about their hopes and fears and dreams for the future. Aria learned that Everett had lost his entire family to a raid during the war, that he had joined the army seeking vengeance and found only more death and pain. She learned that he had returned from the border determined to find a different way to live, a way that did not involve hatred and killing. Everett learned about Aria's mother, who had died in childbirth, and her father who had raised her alone and taught her to be strong and proud. He learned about the orcish traditions of honor and loyalty, about the complex social structures of the clans, about the rich culture that humans dismissed as savage barbarism. And slowly, carefully, they fell in love. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was the quiet building of trust and understanding, the warmth that grew between them through shared experiences and genuine connection. It was the way Everett made sure Aria had her favorite foods at meals, the way Aria learned to read Everett's moods and offer comfort when old memories troubled him. It was the way they fit together, two damaged people finding healing in each other's company. The night before the month ended, they sat together in the courtyard garden beneath the stars. Aria leaned against Everett's shoulder, feeling safe in a way she had never expected to feel in this place. "Tomorrow we must give the king our answer," she said quietly. "I know." Everett's arm was around her waist, holding her close. "What do you want, Aria?" She turned to look at him, at his kind face and his gentle eyes and the strength in his features. "I want to marry you, not because of the peace treaty, not because I have no choice, but because I love you." Everett's breath caught. "You love me." "I do," Aria said. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a month, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it now." Everett cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle on her green skin. "I love you too. I have loved you since the moment you refused to bow, when you stood up for yourself and showed the entire court what real courage looks like." He leaned forward and kissed her gently, and Aria felt her heart soar. When they finally parted, both of them were smiling. "So we will tell the king yes?" Everett asked. "We will tell the king yes," Aria confirmed. The next day they stood before King Aldrich once more, but this time the great hall was less crowded. Only the essential nobles and officials were present, and the atmosphere was more formal than hostile. Cyrus Ashford stood to one side, his face still dark with anger, but he said nothing. King Aldrich looked at them both. "Have you reached a decision?" "We have, Your Majesty," Everett said. "We wish to marry." "And you are certain, both of you?" "I am certain," Aria said firmly. "Everett Dalton is the finest man I have ever known, human or orc. I would be honored to be his wife." The king nodded slowly. "Then let it be so. The marriage will take place 1 week from today, and the peace treaty will be sealed through your union. Everett Dalton, I grant you the title of knight and lands befitting your new station, so that your marriage will satisfy even the most particular requirements of nobility." Everett bowed deeply. "Thank you, Your Majesty." The week that followed was a blur of preparations. Aria's father and several representatives from the Stonefist clan arrived for the wedding, and there was a tearful reunion in which her father embraced her and told her how proud he was of her courage. The Orcish delegation met with Everett and, after some initial wariness, accepted him as a son of their clan. The wedding itself was a blend of human and Orcish traditions. Aria wore a dress of green and silver, and Everett wore formal armor polished until it gleamed. They exchanged vows before both the human priest and an Orcish shaman, pledging themselves to each other before both their gods. Aria's father placed a traditional Orcish marriage braid in her hair, and King Aldrich himself placed the knight's chain around Everett's neck. When the ceremony ended and they were pronounced husband and wife, Everett pulled Aria close and kissed her deeply, and the hall erupted in applause from both humans and orcs. It was not perfect. There were still nobles who looked at them with distaste and orcs who muttered about tradition being broken, but it was a beginning. King Aldrich granted them a small estate on the border between human and orc lands, a place where they could serve as a bridge between the two peoples. The estate had a manor house and farmlands and stables, and Everett immediately set about making it into a home while Aria worked to establish relationships with both the nearby human villages and the Orcish settlements in the mountains. Months passed, and the peace held. There were incidents, of course, small conflicts and misunderstandings that had to be mediated, but Aria and Everett were there to help smooth over difficulties and build trust between their peoples. They hosted gatherings where humans and orcs could meet in neutral territory, where children could play together, and adults could begin to see each other as people rather than enemies. On a warm evening nearly a year after their wedding, Aria stood on the balcony of their manor and looked out over the valley. Everett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Aria leaned back against him, smiling. "I am thinking about how I came to Valorhold expecting to sacrifice myself for peace, and instead I found you. I found love and happiness and a real future." "I am the fortunate one," Everett said quietly. "You gave me purpose again. You gave me something worth building instead of something worth destroying." Aria turned in his arms to face him. "We gave each other that. We built it together." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and in that moment she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. She had refused to bow to the proud court who wanted to see her humiliated, but she had knelt willingly beside this quiet man who had shown her nothing but respect and love. She had found her partner, her equal, her home, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream.